I'm Crosby Kemper, the director of the Kansas City Public Library, and we're glad to have you all here. Before Bob and I talk about his governorship, you know, tonight is the official unveiling, which implies there might have been a cover-up before, but I won't go into that. I won't go into that, I promise. Unveiling of the portraits, Bob Holden's official portrait as governor, and also Lori Holden's official portrait as First Lady, which is already hanging in the mansion in Jefferson City, except it's here tonight, so I have to tell you, it is a crime. We stole it. Carla stole it today from the governor's mansion. I believe there are highway patrolmen circling the library as we speak. Anyway, but it's my pleasure to talk to you for a minute about the commissioning of the portrait and the style of the portraits. Carla Malone Steck, who has been a regular friend of the library. She's directed the Atelier CMS in Jefferson City, been very responsible for arts programs in Jefferson City, has worked with the library to present this event, and is a great artist, as you can see from the portraits. So Carla, would you come up and talk about them for a minute?
So thank you very much. I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad to know Governor Bob Holden and his First Lady, Lori Hauser Holden, who brought a great deal of culture to Jefferson City, Missouri. The city itself houses in the Capitol the governor's portraits in the rotunda, and then in the governor's mansion there's a collection of First Ladies' portraits. And across the street is a historical society which then collects the gowns. The opportunity to paint the First Lady's portrait came first, and this was an exciting proposal that I submitted early on. I thought it was exciting anyway. It took about 3 years to confirm that, opportunity. And the important thing that I want to stand up here and tell you tonight is to get up close to the paintings after the talk tonight and the unveiling of a governor himself, because the first painting to be finished was actually a collaborative with many other Missouri artists. Luckily, the First Lady wanted a Missouri woman to paint her portrait, and so I was lucky in a couple of areas there. I'm not the best of the Missouri artists, but I happen to know them from their time in Jefferson City. So it wasn't too long after that I started pursuing Bob's official portrait, and I think our friendship, Lori and I's friendship, helped make that happen. And I looked back at a few emails the other day, and I think it was 2007 when I first started requesting this. So after the talk, I want you to know a few things about the portrait of the First Lady. Notice the frame. The frame is made up of many elements of their life as a family. And so I did design the frame and hired a artist to carve it. And you can see his work locally at Trader Joe's, I've just recently found out. So his name is Fetty, and he's done all the paintings in Trader Joe's. The governor's portrait took about a year. I like to say I lived with Bob for a little over a year, and then he's probably going to go home tonight. But anyway, the interesting thing about both portraits is it's a classical approach. I'm trained as a classical artist, and I didn't plan on the background for the governor's portrait, but what you'll see in the background is a private area of the Capitol. It's called the portico, and the portico is obviously off limits to the public, but the little window is where the governor would sit and spend his time in a great deal of thought, and the background also includes a Missouri landscape. So those are some of the details that I'd like for you to see when you get up close after the event tonight. I'm now an official Kansas City artist. I'm proud to say that I live here and have enjoyed the positive feeling for the arts here, and I look forward to visiting with you after the event. And I want to thank the library for inviting us here tonight, and for the governor to actually make it here as well, and the First Lady, Lori Hauser Holden. If you don't know her, she's in the front row over here. And why don't you stand up? Lori Hauser Holden. And so thank you, and I hope we have a great program, and I'm sure they'll tell you a little bit about the technology that we want to include with this portrait. When young children come to the Capitol, we hope that they'll be able to click and find a conversation with the governor and learn more about the governor. So I turn it over to you, gentlemen. Thank you very much.
I have to tell you, it is a great pleasure for me to have Bob Holden here, our 53rd governor of the great state of Missouri. You know, before I became a librarian, I was a banker, and Bob was state treasurer, and Bob and I spent many hours trying to negotiate interest rates. You know, I was trying to lower them, he was trying to raise them, and he was always pretty successful at doing that. And we shared a lot of other interests, and their family, my family, my former wife Hillary and Lori and Bob and I spent some time together, bankers conventions and things like that. And I have to tell you, one of the things that is always hard to know about a politician, if you're seeing it from afar, if you don't get to know them personally well, is what a nice guy Bob Holden is, what a good guy he is, and the interests of the state of Missouri in the broadest possible sense have always been in his mind and his heart. So it's an honor to have you here tonight, Bob. So thanks for doing this. I think this is the first official retrospective conversation about his governorship that Bob's had. So we're so glad that you're here. But I do want to resolve an issue particularly from your first campaign for governor, when I believe there were about 8 or 9 or 10 places in the state that you claimed as your home while you were campaigning. So where were you actually born, Bob?
I was born here in Kansas City at St. Luke's Hospital.
See, he's a Kansas City boy makes good. Kansas City boy makes good.
Crosby, in fact, we tell the story that my mom's family was one of the original commission companies at the Kansas City Stockyards. And my dad had been asked to leave the farm by his father. So he came to Kansas City, took a job with the Laird Brothers Commission Company, and that's where my mom and dad met. And I was born here and then moved back to the family farm when my dad was invited to come back 3 years later. Right. But so Kansas City's always been a very important
You're born
place.
here, so you're really Kansas City, and if that question should ever come up in any bars that you visit, really, Bob Holden's a real Kansas City, yeah. But you grew up on a farm in Shannon County, the small town Birch Tree. And talk about growing up on the farm and what that was like.
Well, it was a world totally foreign to my wife. Not my wife, my mother. I don't want to get totally foreign to my wife, too.
Yeah. I think that no truer words were ever spoken. Yeah.
But my dad moved back with my mom into the great-grandparents' house that had been used as a storage bin. Didn't have indoor plumbing or anything like that. And here you're a young lady in Kansas City, Missouri. Winstead's on the Plaza was her stomping grounds as a young person. And that was, as you could say, the least quite a change. But my mom stuck it out, and I couldn't have had a better person to be a mother than my mother.
And you talk about growing up and going to school in a one-room schoolhouse, and so you really have the proverbial, almost log cabin-like political background, perfect background.
There was 3 of us in my first grade. I graduated the class of 25, and had an opportunity to go on to college, and had a professor that really opened the door. He had got his degree at Johns Hopkins University in International Relations, International Law. But that's the reason education has always been such an important part of my life. Not as a political issue, but very much a personal issue. Because without those teachers in those early grades, even though it was a small school, in high school and on to college, I would have never had the opportunity to do the things in life that I've been allowed to do. Thanks to many of you in this room for your votes and all of that, but those were the teachers. And our second son is named after Lori's grandmother and my college professor. It's an honor to them for what they've given to all of us. And that's really the one thing that I think is very important that all of us remember. We have a responsibility to give back. Because all of us sitting in this room, the success that we've had has been brought about by the people around us that helped us along the way.
And I think you told me that he was in addition to being your professor, he was the chairman of the Greene County Democratic Party, which...
All two of us.
Yeah, I was going to say, in those days, that was a lonely job, you know, in Greene County. But it's also said, Bob, that you might have indicated at the age of 5 that you intended to become governor. Is this story true?
Well, I don't think so, but it's amazing. After I got elected treasurer and later governor, I had all of these friends come back, tell me stories about, well, when you were 5, you said this to me, or when you were 6, you said this. I don't remember any of those conversations, but everybody seems to remember them on my behalf.
Right. Well, we promised to spread that rumor anyway. So from this meeting, and you've also told me about was it your grandmother or an aunt who used to give you books when you were a kid? And of course, obviously in Birch Tree there wouldn't have been too many books or too many opportunities for that. But you were a reader as a young boy, and you read the biographies and.
Yeah, my grandmother, who lived here in Kansas City, worked at Macy's and had been a teacher before that, and she used to buy landmark books of famous Americans, Abraham Lincoln, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and you'd read all of these stories about these great leaders, whether you agreed with them on their politics or not, but the integrity that they had embodied within their mindset. And so that truly shaped a lot of, later in life, my priorities and my values. And I would encourage you, if you are not a member of the Kansas City Public Library, do so. Libraries are very important. They were important in my hometown because we didn't have a bookstore close by. We didn't have the TV that our kids now use. So it's those books that really are the first entree into a much larger world and whets the appetite to learn more and do more.
You know, one of the other things that's great about you, Bob, and I remember, when we were friends early on talking about how you love to go to the state parks in Missouri, take your vacations in state parks and that sort of thing. You were actually a ranger, a state park ranger?
No. I worked at a state park.
You worked in a state park.
My job was to clean the bathrooms and cut the grass and collect the camping fees at night.
We're still going to tell people you were a ranger. Spread that rumor too, okay.
But what is interesting about that, Crosby, is it's amazing how many people you meet from all walks of life collecting those camping fees. And so, again, for someone who came from a very small rural community, that's a way to see a much wider world available. And I wasn't the best grass cutter in the world, and I'm sure I didn't do the best job of cleaning up the restaurant at night and things like that, but it was a great experience. And it also is a connector that at the end of the day, we are the custodians of our environment. That's the reason state parks and all of the environmental issues are so very, very important to all of us. And so I had a great time.
And as governor, some of the things you learned there, I mean, you did a lot for parks as governor. The Missouri, Mississippi.
The confluence of Missouri and the Mississippi, I signed into law that as a state park. One of the first acts I did as governor of the state of Missouri. And anywhere that I could throughout my political career, I tried to promote the state parks, the Katy Trails. I hope that some of you have been on the Katy Trail. Hopefully we'll get expanded one of these days.
Yeah,
but I remember when I first involved with that, it was very unpopular because all these farmers were very concerned that all of these ne'er-do-wells from the city would be coming in and messing up their land and things like this.
Riding their bicycles into their cows. You know, my
That
one,
probably has happened a time or two, too.
right. You know, Bob, my one foray into electoral politics, I ran for the state legislature in 1980, and I was looking at the Missouri budget to see where you could cut something, and I saw the Department of Conservation was spending all this money, more money than any other state on a per capita basis. So I came out with this program to move some of the money from the Department of Conservation into, you know, medical or education or whatever. And it was at that moment that I realized where the real power in the state of Missouri was. Ducks Unlimited came after me. And you know, the one thing you don't want to do as governor or as a state legislator or whatever is to challenge the people who shoot and eat cows and ducks. So,
and I did something in many people's eyes probably just about as bad. I actually put women on the commission. There was 4 commissioners, and they never, I don't think, ever had a woman. And I put 2 on there, one of them from the Kansas City area, because I truly wanted it to be much wider as an organization than it had been in the past. And one of the things I take a tremendous amount of pride in as governor is, I hope in so many different ways, I opened opportunities for elements of our society that had never been invited to sit at the table. When I came into office as governor, Missouri was 41st in the nation in terms of women in leadership positions. When I left, we were number 5. I appointed numerous African Americans to the bench. 4 of my 10 department heads were African Americans. I set up the Hispanic Commission so that we could start trying to involve the Hispanic community in our society in the decision making. The gay and lesbian community need to be sitting at the table to help fashion our future. If we're going to be a global society, if we're going to compete successfully, we've got to reflect a much wider community than historically we have in the past. And that's something I take a great deal of pride in.
I do want to take you back to some of the inspiration for your political career. Your first run for political office was in college, and you ran for...
Student body? Well, I ran for the state senate against an upperclassman that supposedly couldn't be beat, and I won. Dave Heinlein, that professor, I asked him if I could go and speak to the political science students in the political science classes. That had never been done before. And he said, well, why not? So I did, and I beat the upperclassmen. And then after that, I decided that I wanted to run for student body president. This is in the late 60s, early 70s. I was part of the political science department. Those of you who have been through college, you understand when you say political science, what that means in context of the Vietnam War and civil rights movement. But I made the decision to run student body president, and I picked a woman to be my vice president, and that had never been done before. We lost that race. I ran on a platform of a student on the board of regents, which there's only one university in the country at the time that had done something like that, and that was Harvard. We talked about co-op bookstores, co-op banks, so that the students could really have an active, involved role in making decisions about their lives on the campus. Came up short against the establishment candidates, but the gentleman that ended up winning student body president was Jeff Shapercutter, who later became a judge, later a member of the Missouri House of Representatives, and we're still friends to this day.
Yeah, that's great. And you know, this Harvard thing, you also were a Fleming Fellow, is that right, at Harvard? I personally, as a Yaley, I think that probably explains why you're one-term governor, but... But I want to go back to your inspiration, because you talk about the 60s and you know, that's when you really got your political start, and there was a lot going on. You mentioned the Vietnam War and civil rights, and was there one person who was any of the leaders there, Martin Luther King or the Kennedys, or who was an inspiration to you?
I became very enamored with the philosophy behind Robert Kennedy and what he was trying to do to build a cohesiveness in our culture and our society, and also with Martin Luther King. And when both of those individuals were assassinated. I really thought about dropping out of any interest in political involvement at all. But I'll never forget, one day I was walking through the hayfields on our farm, and I came to the conclusion that if those men stood for something, they were willing to die for something. What kind of person would I be willing to walk away from that same fight? And so that's when I made the decision that public life was going to be what I did through the course of time. And I always kept the focus that all of us in public office, our first responsibility should be to represent the best interests of our citizens and the best interests for their future.
Amen. And so you get involved in politics. You went to work for Jim Spainhour, who was the state treasurer, also a friend of mine. Jim's a great guy, and you know, I think one of the...
A wonderful public official.
Yeah. He again is a guy like you who had the interests of the whole state, was able to work across the partisan boundaries. I do remember once when he was running for governor in 1980, he called me and asked me to have lunch with him. We'd been friendly. You know, as a banker, I was talking to him about the same things I talked to you about as state treasurer, and he beat me up a little bit because I'd been out on the campaign trail and I called him a liberal, and which I think may have been true, but in any case, it was an epithet in the state of Missouri at that time. But he was a very good guy. What did you learn from Jim?
Well, first of all, he's as classy, honest public official as I've ever met. He told me one time, I've traveled with him all the time just about, and we were talking about, because as a public official, you always have people wanting your help and helping them find a job, find a role in life, and many times public people will do that without really thinking about what they're doing. If it's a friend of mine, that's all that's important. And Jim took a little bit different tact. And he said, you know, if you appoint someone to a position that they're not qualified for, you know it, they know it, and sooner or later the public is going to know it. If that person is really a friend of yours, why would you do that to them? And that stuck with me. And Carol Gilstrap is here. We were in the treasurer's office together. And she can vouch for the integrity that this man had. And that stayed with me throughout my entire life. He also helped open the doors to my work with Senator Eagleton, Congressman Gephardt, and Mel Carnahan. Those were the four people that were my bosses before I ever got elected to office, got married, and now my boss is sitting in the audience.
That's pretty much a great list of Missouri politicians that you got there who are your mentors. So
I've always felt that the best way to protect yourself and your integrity is surround yourself with people that just as strong, if not higher integrity than you have. And that's what all of those people did for me. And is what Steve Rowling and Scott Lakin, who are in the Audits 2 department heads, did for me as governor. Is I would tell all of my department heads, I never want you to do anything that puts politics ahead of sound public policy. And to carry that out is people like Steve Rowling and Scott Lakin, who deserve a lot of the credit for anything that we might have achieved while I was in office. Where are they? They were here.
Yeah,
there's Scott.
Over there. Great. And did both have national reputations in what they did for you at the state level. And Bob, you got elected to the state House from Springfield as a Democrat, which itself
surprised everybody.
Is itself a tribute to you, and then became state treasurer. You ran for state treasurer,
and I ran for treasurer, got defeated for treasurer.
Defeated first time, yeah.
By a gentleman by the name of Wendell Bailey. If you remember Wendell. Wendell knew how to get the press in those days.
He was very good, yeah. Sometimes going through security at airports, too, you know. Wendell got... Yeah, Wendell, I remember, Bob, it's a great story. I was at a debate, a Republican debate. A whole group of people were running for governor. Bill Webster was then Attorney General. Wendell was then State Treasurer. Were running the Republican primary for governor. And Wendell stood up, and we'll talk about what you did as State Treasurer. Wendell stood up and said, you know, I invested 107% of the money of the state of Missouri. And then Bill Webster got up after him, the Attorney General, and said, I believe that's illegal, Wendell. But,
you know, what is interesting about all of that, Crosby, as a legislator, the Speaker of the House, Bob Griffin, put me in charge of the Appropriation Committee for all the statewide officials. And that's when Bill Webster was Attorney General, getting ready to run for governor. Roy Blunt from Springfield, who was a friend of mine, was wanting to run for governor, was friends of John Ashcroft, and Wendell Bailey, who was kind of a maverick in this crowd. But as chairman of that Appropriation Committee, my job and the job of my committee was to try to do what we thought was best in the way of expenditures for these different departments. Carol knows what I'm talking about. And the process had been, with Senator Webster being in the Senate, Bill Webster being an Attorney General, that each year somehow the Attorney General's budget got improved, as everybody else's stayed pretty flat in that process. And when the Speaker asked me if I was willing to do it, I said I will, but I will treat everybody fairly. And he gave me the green light and said, go ahead and do that. So the first budget came through. The Senate added additional money to the process. I took it out. It went to conference. The money was put back in, but I refused to sign it, and so it didn't come out. And we were up to the last day of the legal session of the budget, and I wouldn't budge, didn't budge. They finally compromised, and my fellow Democratic senator stood up in the Missouri Senate and said that young whippersnapper from Springfield, Missouri had just ended his political career.
well, you know, as state treasurer, you were honest and honorable and pretty conservative, and, you know, tough fiscal times. You preserved our credit rating. The state of Missouri has always had a great credit rating, and
one of only 7 states.
Yeah, a AAA credit rating, which we still have. You also created some great programs. You know, the financial education has become a big deal. The legislature now has passed legislation mandating it, et cetera. But you really were a pioneer in that area. I remember working with you.
Dollars and cents.
Dollars and cents program.
They actually didn't believe that bankers would be willing to work with the state treasurer. But we worked it out where the banks were involved, the treasurer's office was involved, and the teachers were involved. And the whole idea, again, comes back to my background. That's the reason it's important to know the background of these people you're thinking about electing to office. But my father, more than anything else in life, had wanted his kids to go on to college because his family didn't believe that college education was needed or important or necessary, was a waste of time. And so he started giving me an allowance of 25 cents a week with the idea that 10 cents was to go into the local bank account for my college education. And I always remembered that, and when I got elected state treasurer, we did the dollars and cents program that set the partnership between the banks and the schools and our office to teach young people the importance of saving and investing. It's also the genesis for the MOST program, which is Missouri's 529 program, which when we passed it while I was treasurer, was considered one of the 5 best investment options for children's savings for education of anywhere in the country. But what was different about it is we set it up so that you could start out for as little as $25 investment. I wanted it to be set up so that any family in this state, no matter how poor they are, could start saving for their children's education. And if they start when they're young enough, then by the time they're 18, you would have some money in the bank to really give that child the same chance of opportunity as people of more means in life. And it's the MOST program and the dollars and cents, those type of programs are some of the things that I'm most proud of, because it's a way to help people lift themselves out of the economic environment they're in to a higher calling. And that should be what public service is about at whatever level.
Amen. Great program. In the beginning, I think of a wave of things in this state and in other states that have been good. You also focused on housing. That was part of the state treasurer's, and is still part of the state treasurer's responsibility, is to help the housing programs. The Missouri Housing Development Corporation, problem we've had here in Kansas City, get it going in recent years. But you were a very strong advocate of.
And Jim Spanhard started. Jim Spanhard and Kip Bond, when he was governor, are the people that really passed that legislation to put together the Missouri Housing Development Commission, which during that time, and I can't speak to it today because I haven't followed it, but it was considered probably the best run housing agency in the country. I mean, there was no issues of questionable investments or handling or anything else, and it was because those people really cared to do what was right about the housing. It wasn't about somebody making money, it was about creating housing.
And part of it is you weren't the only one in state government to do this historically, but I appreciate that you did. You operated in a nonpartisan way. One of the things about Bob that you should know is that I think he mentioned maintaining friendships with some people like Roy Blunt and whatnot, but your ability to maintain friendships across the aisle and to do things in a nonpartisan way has been one of your hallmarks. And when you ran for governor, you ran against Jim Talent for first time out, and I think we want to talk about that campaign for governor. But you remain friends with Jim ever since, despite that very close, hard-fought election. Talk about that. Talk about your decision to run for governor and what that campaign was like. And
well, I mean, and Jim and I have remained friends. We may not agree on 90% of the issues in the state, but one of the things that I have always taken from my life, the first autographed picture of a politician I ever got was from Jack Danforth when I was a student at then Southwest Missouri State University. Greg Curls, who later went to work at Bank of America and all of that, we were sitting next to each other in Dave Heinlein's international relations class, and he said, I know this young Republican that we ought to have down here as a speaker, and I was president of the Political Economy Club. And so I invited him to come down. He spoke. I got to fly on the plane going back, and that's pretty heady stuff for a college student in those days. And watched him go on his career to where he served in the Senate along with Senator Tom Eagleton. And there was two people from two different political parties who didn't always share the same political view of life by any stretch of the imagination, could debate very aggressively on the Senate floor and still walk out respecting each other and the institution that they were in. And that stuck with me for my entire life, is that's what it should be about. And Jim Talent and I, as I said, didn't agree on probably very many issues, but we could have our debate, have our discussion, and still walk out and respecting each other as people and for the views that we share. I've had, Jim has participated in my public policy program at Webster University. Catherine Hanaway has participated in the program, and we all know of my close friendship with Catherine Hanaway.
We'll get into that now.
John Hancock and the rest.
Yeah. But, we've lost a little bit of that in American politics, the ability to do that. There are the great stories about Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill being able to have a beer together after 5 o'clock and getting along. That doesn't really happen, at least nationally. It doesn't happen in Washington anymore.
And I think so much of this, and this is, of course, my feelings, but so much of this is caused by the unlimited amount of money in the political system. These people that get elected to office today have to spend all of their waking hours, except when they're actually casting a vote, raising money. And then you add term limits into that process. You've got a constant gelling of new faces who don't have the knowledge and the experience, who have to rely upon staff or lobbyists to give them the information they need to make a decision. And that information, whether it be good information or not, is still tainted by the background of those individuals. And I've said, I would have much rather have dealt with a crisis I had to deal with people that may not philosophically agree with me on anything, but they knew the budget, and they knew the hole that we were in and what we had to do, and we would have found a way to have some common ground. And that's what I don't see going on in Washington, D.C. Today, nor in our state capitals around the country. And that's got to change for our democracy to truly get reinvigorated and be a leader once again in this global economy.
Right. I think I agree with you about that. I see that I was a fan of and voted for term limits early on, but I've watched what's happened there. With term limits, one of the things that's happened in Missouri politics, and it's true of Democrats and Republicans, I don't think it's a partisan thing, is you have people who are relatively inexperienced and very young, and inexperienced and young and think they know everything, who run our politics, and they don't have the seasoned nature, just what you said about the budget, they don't really frequently understand it. They don't have enough time.
And if they have ambitions to do other things in life besides being a state representative or a state senator, they know that they've got to build a resume and a record very quickly. Well, you don't build a resume and a record quickly if you're reading all that stack of budget books day in and day out trying to figure out what it is. You build your resume by being on the front page of the newspaper. You get on the front page of the newspaper by making charges and countercharges, not by having thoughtful discussion about the difficulty of our budget and where we need to make cuts and things like this in an appropriate fashion. And so I think it's really lessened the participatory aspect of our democracy, which I regret, and I want to see us one of these days return to.
Yeah, that's right. And let's go back to that campaign for governor, because there's a unique event in the history of American politics, really, in your campaign for governor, and that is there's another race going on at the same time, the campaign for the Senate. And the then Governor Mel Carnahan was running for the Senate, and there's the plane crash that killed him and his son, and politics really stopped at the end of the campaign. It was a very close race with Jim Talent. What was that like?
Well, first of all, Mel Carnahan was born in Birch Tree, Missouri. I was raised there. This town of 600 people, actually 300 people at that time. We didn't spend a lot of time together. We didn't have to. We knew where each other was coming from. And so from a personal standpoint, there was a lot invested in there. But I was down in the Boot Hill to give a speech. Mel Carnahan was coming down, and he was going to speak to the group, I believe, after I spoke, and his plane was delayed. It kept being delayed. Now, I'll never forget talking to the security person waiting for his plane to land. And just on the look on her face, I knew something was wrong. That's when the crash occurred. I actually thought that our campaign probably was ending because you could just feel the energy leave the Democratic activists in the state. And come to find out, Jim felt like...
Yeah, I told Bob yesterday, I happened to be with Jim Talent on the Sunday before the election in the Chiefs were playing the Rams. And it was the Sunday before the election at Arrowhead, and I happened to be in a suite with him and was talking to him about the election. And he said, you know, I'm going to lose. He said, our polls, the Talent polls, showed me slightly ahead and moving in the right way, momentum in our direction right before the plane crash, and after the plane crash, it exactly reversed. And he said, so I'm going to lose. Bob is going to beat you. But you had the same feeling at that point.
I remember we debated, how quickly we could go back up, what would be the appropriate time of respect. At the same time, we had an election just a few days away, and I'll never forget, we cut a new TV ad in a home in St. Louis, because I was in St. Louis at the time, at 2:30 in the morning to go up the next day. And it was what we would call a very soft political ad to try to let people know, hey, we still had an election. But your heart, even though you knew the election was close at hand, it still, my heart was hard to get motivated in the emotions of the time. I'm sure that Jim and his campaign was living the same thing, and so was John Ashcroft. probably the person that had the most difficult decision to make in all this was John Ashcroft. Because how do you react in those set of circumstances? Because here you and Mel Carnahan have been fighting tooth and nail, and they weren't close friends, to say the least. But suddenly it's all stopped, and it changes.
But you were elected, one of the closer elections in Missouri history. How many votes per precinct?
About 20,000, which is about 4 votes per precinct in the state of Missouri.
Yeah.
So when you watched Iowa last week and Romney won the caucuses by 8 votes, you know, every vote does
Every
count.
vote counts.
So I hope
Good.
you're all registered and you get other people registered,
That's-
irrespective of what your politics is,
Right.
because you need to participate.
I vote as often as they'll let me.
How many times do you vote in any one election?
Right. City of St. Louis, it's easy to do that. But anyway, well, so you're governor, and there's a famous moment. We have to discuss this, Bob. Your inaugural, and you know, it's a great moment. Things are flying high, but your inaugural turns out to be one of the big problems for your governorship. Your first day is actually maybe in many ways your worst day and your worst problem. Talk about that. For those of you who don't remember this, it turned out to be an expensive inaugural. You got a lot of criticism for it.
Sure.
Look back on that.
Well, first of all, we've talked about what happened with Governor Carnahan and what that did to the state. Secondly, for those that have been around a capital, probably any capital in the country, Missouri is one of them, the idea of inaugurations is usually a good time to party. Sometimes the parties go on a lot longer and a lot more actively than some would like. Lori and I, with our feeling importance of children, wanted to change that. First of all, we did not spend any more taxpayers' money than was spent on any other inauguration. The rest of the funds were private dollars. But what we did do is the night before the inauguration, we had invited all of these different artists from Missouri to come and perform free for everybody that wanted to come. Secondly, we set up a youth inauguration so that the young people from all of these families around Missouri could bring their children and have them participating. We had a youth ball, we did stuff with the museums, and the whole idea behind that was, one, to send the message that we cared about children. But I've always found that grown-ups act a lot better when their children are in the room. And so that's the message that we were trying to send. And it did send. In fact, I probably had more Republicans come up to me and thank me for doing this for their families than I had Democrats. But the mistake that I could be accused of making, but I would still do it again today, we owed some money on the inauguration. And typically what happens when a politician owes somebody money, they negotiate the cost down. And I refused to do that. I called up all the vendors that we owed money to, and there wasn't many, but I said, I will pay you off, I will raise the money, but give me time until after the session's over with, because I was dealing with that first budget. And I thought that was more important for me to focus my attention on the budget of the state of Missouri. And every one of the vendors said, that's okay. And I said, I'll pay you in full. We won't negotiate down 10 cents on the dollar or anything else. And that's what happened. But during that time period, the press picked up the issue about the fact that we had this inauguration and
The $1 million figure is probably what kicked you. So you got tagged with the $1 million inauguration, and then later on with the use of the plane for state business, which turns out to be a kind of general problem in the state. The Governor Nixon's, pretty much you can't do it without getting tagged with get around the state. Though Matt drove back and forth to Springfield, taking about 4 hours each day to do that, but that's another story. But I won't ask you to criticize a fellow Democrat, Senator McCaskill, who beat you for re-election, who criticized you about planes and who may have herself had her own problem with planes. I won't ask you that question, so that we don't have to go there. But we are.
But you know what's interesting? The plane that I got criticized for was a plane that was purchased when this economy in Missouri was going great guns in the 90s, and they got a jet that traveled much faster, and they made a good deal. We actually made money off of selling the plane. But when I got in office and the economy went south, then the idea that a governor was flying around in a jet from Jefferson City to St. Louis or Kansas City, again, became a front page headline. We sold the plane, and as I said, actually made money over what the cost of the plane was originally.
Well, and you've just introduced a topic that really haunted your governorship and has really, in a way, haunted the two governors since, Republican Matt Blunt and Democrat Jay Nixon, which is on the day you were inaugurated, it was just about the moment everything collapsed. Because in the 90s, we were talking about, and you probably were thinking about this when you became governor, how we were going to spend the surplus. And then the dot-com boom crashed literally about the time you're inaugurated. So
we hit a recession right at the very time. I think the day of or the day after, I got the word that American Airlines was pulling out the hubs in St. Louis and downplaying what was going on here. In the 90s, with a very strong economy, the legislature and the executive office had passed some very good legislation in health care and education that suddenly those bills had to be paid. And so I walked in with about an $850 million hole in the budget. The day I walked into office, within 2 weeks after I was sworn in office, we made a cut of $180 million in the budget. And I was told at the time that that was the deepest core cuts in the history of the state of Missouri up to that point. I ended up cutting over $1 billion out of that state budget. That does not make you very popular, particularly for a Democrat. If you're a Republican, you're actually strengthening your base. But we had these unfunded mandates from the federal government. We had commitments on programs that had been passed in the 90s. And then since we had so much extra money in the 90s, they decided it was time to cut the different taxes. You probably don't remember any of the taxes that were cut. But all of that...
Got a Hancock rebates in
the Hancock rebates that
2000,
came in.
Yeah.
We were starting to fund the Iraq War as a nation. And so those issues were there. Our economy had gone south. In my first year in office, we were one of the leading states in the nation in job loss because so many of our jobs were tied around heavy manufacturing. Time I left office, we were one of the 10 states that were creating the most jobs. But anytime you try to change your economy, and we focused on doing that, moving away from the old line industries into advanced manufacturing, information technology, plant and life sciences, those take time before you really build a foundation for those jobs to be created. But I felt like that if Missouri was going to compete in this global economy, we had to more adequately reflect a global economy in what we were doing. But all of those that I'm talking about require a much stronger commitment to education at the preschool level all the way through the universities, because you don't get there without intelligent constituents and citizens taking those jobs.
And so you fought for things like life science funding and the A+ school program.
Even in the tough times, 3 of the 4 years, we added money to the school foundation formula. We added money to the A+ program. We added money to the early childhood education program. The one area that I felt badly that we didn't do as much as I would have liked was in higher education. I had a choice to make on whether we were going to fund elementary education or higher education. I made the decision to fund elementary education because my attitude was if your elementary educational system is not functioning and you're not producing students able to go to higher education, what good does it do you to have a higher education program without the foundation being there?
And there, Bob and I agreed about this. Bob very kindly, reaching across the aisle, appointed me chair of the Commission on Higher Education in Missouri. And one of the conclusions our commission came to was precisely that the success, the graduation rate in institutions of higher education in Missouri is directly related to the A+ programs. Students who'd go through high schools that had the A+ program had a 90% graduation rate. And so the investment, the conclusion we came to, and Charlie McLean, who had chaired a previous commission for Mel Carnahan, for John Ashcroft, had come to exactly the same conclusion, that unless you did that work at the K through 12 level, what you did in higher education wouldn't work. Well, you know, talk for a minute about one of the things that happened while you were governor and must have changed everything you did personally and the personal life of the family and the mansion and whatnot. 9/11 happened, a terrorist attack on America. And what was it like living as governor in the mansion and with all of a sudden having these concerns?
Well, to say the least, that changed everybody's priorities in our society. And what most people don't realize in Missouri, in many ways at that time, how vulnerable we were as a region or as a state. We have 2 of the 7 most important military installations in the country within our borders. We have major sports venues, major urban areas. We've got nuclear power plants, facilities in the state. A lot of the fresh water in the world travels through our state and around our state. You've got all of these different elements, and you come to find out there's very little communication between one city versus another, or one county versus another, or one region of the state versus another. And so Missouri was the first state in the nation to put someone in charge of Homeland Security and start trying to tie all of those different elements together. Dennis Shull was the Adjutant General, soldier, while I was governor. Steve Danner is there now. And telehealth and everything else came about because of all of that. But, you know, as a governor, you have control of the National Guard, but you don't control the national defense. At the same time, if something happens in your state, you're still going to be held accountable and responsible for it. And so we reacted, I think, very quickly and very well. And I'm very proud of what our medical community, our service community, our military community has done over the years, and really putting Missouri in a position to be able to respond to anything that might happen. And you talk about an emotional, trying time, and Lori and I were just looking through photographs the other night, and there was a picture that we were looking at that we had dinner one time in New York at the Twin Towers.
Yeah.
And those are no longer there.
Yeah.
Our country, our culture will never be the same again. But at the same time, we can't hide. We've got to go forward, and we've got to build, and we've got to be willing to engage so that doesn't ever happen again in our society or any society.
So Bob, best day, worst day as governor. What was your best day?
Well, my wife always says that I look at everything as a glass half full or 2/3 full.
Overflowing, she says. Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's what we want. Yeah.
First of all, I worked with wonderful people in my office and people around the state of Missouri. Secondly, you could look at the circumstances that I was thrown into and say, why did this have to happen to me? But at the same time, if God or whatever had not thought I wasn't capable of making the decisions, I wouldn't have been there. And so I took, in some way, comfort that I'd rather have me sitting there making those decisions because I thought I had the right priorities. What would I want for our kids? And what would you want for your kids if you were the one sitting in that office at that time? And that's how I approached the decision. It's not as complicated as some people make it out to be. It's only complicated when you try to factor in how do I do this to figure this, to get around this. Make your call. Is it the right thing or the wrong thing? That's one of the things that I was taught by my dad. I used to tell people, You never want to ask my dad's opinion unless you want an answer, because he's not going to sugarcoat it. And I took that attack. I was trying to be tactful about it. But I was there. I had no real higher ambition than to be governor of the state of Missouri. You know, they always try to say, well, this is a stepping stone. No, when you get to be governor of a state or president of the United States, and I took a leaf from Harry Truman, who is someone I admire immensely, not because he's from Missouri, but because who he was and how he acted. But he said, when people come to this office, every citizen should have equal standing, and they should be judged on what they're advocating on the basis of the merits of their argument, not on who they are, how much money they got behind their name, or anything else. Is it the right thing to do, or it's not? And that's how I approached the office of governor. So, I mean, I didn't look at any bad day. There was days that I would forget pretty easy.
Right.
But every day, because I would tell people, when you're governor, all the easy decisions have been made by somebody else and they've already taken credit for it. All that you get at your desk are the tough decisions, and the answer is a shade of gray. It's not black and it's not white. There's pros and there's cons. And your call is, what is in the best interest of the most people and the long-term interest of the citizens of our state? And that's how those decisions should be made.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think you will all agree with me that from 2001 to 2005, we had a really good man as governor of the state of Missouri, Bob Holden.
Thank you very much, guys.